I was 19 years old when I first heard the word Midway, not from a newspaper, not from a radio broadcast, from my uncle, who came home from the Pacific in the fall of 1942 with a look in his eyes that I didn't understand until I was much older. He sat at our kitchen table in Akron, Ohio, and he stared at the linoleum floor for what felt like a very long time. My mother put coffee in front of him. He didn't touch it, and when he finally spoke, he said almost nothing, just these words. They knew, and they were waiting. I asked him who knew. He shook his head and went quiet again. I didn't understand what he meant then. I was too young, and the war was too large, and the things my uncle had seen were not things a 19-year-old boy from Ohio had any frame of reference or understanding. But I remembered those words, and now, more than 70 years later, I can tell you exactly what he meant. And what I know will change the way you think about that battle and about this war forever. This is not just a story about bombs and aircraft carriers. This is not just a story about the kind of courage that men show when they climb into an airplane and fly it into anti-aircraft fire at 200 miles an hour above an ocean, 1,000 miles from anywhere. Those things are real and they matter enormously, and we will get to them. But before we get to the morning of June 4th, 1942, we need to go somewhere else entirely. We need to go to a basement in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in the weeks and months immediately after the attack that drew America into this war. Because that is where the story really begins. That is where the Battle of Midway was actually won, before a single American plane left the deck of a carrier, before a single bomb fell, before a single Japanese sailor understood that the trap he had walked into had already been designed and waiting for him. The Japanese called their primary naval cipher system JN-25. To understand what that name meant and what it took to break it, you need to understand something about the world as it existed in the first years of the 1940s. The world's major military powers had all, in the decades leading up to the Second World War, invested heavily in both the creation of secure cipher systems for their own communications and in the development of organizations capable of penetrating the cipher systems of their adversaries. This was not new. Governments had been breaking each other's codes since the Renaissance. But the industrialization of warfare had industrialized cryptography along with everything else. The codes were more complex. The traffic was more voluminous. The stakes were higher. The Japanese Navy had developed JN-25 specifically for the most sensitive operational communications within the combined fleet. Previous versions of the system had existed, and American cryptanalysts had made some progress against earlier iterations. But JN-25 as it existed in 1941 and into 1942 was a substantially updated system, and the Americans were starting largely from scratch. The system worked in two distinct stages, and understanding those two stages is essential to understanding why breaking it was so difficult and what it meant that it was broken anyway. In the first stage, a trained cipher clerk would take a message and encode it using a code book. This was a large reference volume, a thick binder, essentially, that assigned 5-digit numerical groups to every word, phrase, place name, ship designation, rank title, operational term, and piece of standard naval vocabulary that might need to appear a message. The word for aircraft carrier might be rendered as 72419. The phrase rendezvous point might be 44831. The name of a specific port might be 91204. Every word and phrase in the original message would be replaced by its assigned 5-digit group, producing a long string of numbers that conveyed the message's content, but did so in a form that was meaningless to anyone who didn't possess the codebook. But that first stage of encryption by itself would have been relatively straightforward for an experienced cryptanalyst to attack. A codebook, no matter how large, is a substitution system, and substitution systems are vulnerable to frequency analysis. The observation that certain code groups will appear more often than others in patterns that correspond to frequency with which certain words and phrases appear in the type of communications being encoded. With enough traffic, a skilled analyst could begin to reconstruct the codebook through pure statistical inference, matching the frequency patterns in the encrypted traffic to the expected frequency patterns of naval operational vocabulary. This is why there was a second stage. Once the message had been converted into numerical groups using the codebook, the cipher clerk applied what cryptographers call a superencipherment additive. This was a separate pad of random 5-digit numbers, different from the code book. The clerk would take the first encoded numerical group and add it, digit by digit and without carrying, to the first random number on the additive pad. Then do the same for the second encoded group and the second additive number, and so on through the entire message. The result was a completely different string of numbers, one that bore no visible relationship to the codebook encoded message, unless you had both the codebook and the additive pad and knew which page and which position the additive pad the clerk had used as a starting point. The Japanese changed their additive pads on a regular schedule. New pads were issued to the fleet and to shore installations, and on a designated changeover date. Everyone switched simultaneously. The theory was that even if an adversary managed to make some progress against the code during one additive period, the change would reset the problem and force them to start again. Fresh traffic against the new additive would be unintelligible until it could be attacked anew, and by the time any meaningful progress had been made, the next changeover would be approaching. It was, on paper, an excellent system. What it didn't fully account for was the sheer volume of Japanese naval communications and the cumulative effect that volume would have on a sustained analytical effort. Station Hypo occupied a low building at Pearl Harbor that its inhabitants called a dungeon, though it was not technically below ground. The name reflected the atmosphere rather than the geography. It was windowless in the working areas, artificially lit, and filled almost continuously with the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the particular attention of people who understood that the work they were doing was important in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone outside the room. The team Rochefort had assembled was small by any bureaucratic standard, perhaps 50 people at its largest, including the radio intercept operators who captured the raw traffic and the analysts and linguists who worked on it. They operated on a schedule that had little relationship to normal working hours. When the traffic demanded attention, attention was given, regardless of what the clock said. Joseph James Rochefort ran this operation with a style that was entirely his own. He had spent 3 years in Japan in the 1920s, living there as a language student in the Navy's immersion program, absorbing not just vocabulary and grammar, but the cultural context that shapes how a language is actually used. He came back from Japan understanding something that purely academic training could not have given him. The way Japanese military and government officials thought and communicated was shaped by institutional structures and cultural assumptions that were deeply different from American ones, and those differences showed up in the communications traffic in ways that matter for interpretation. Rochefort was not an easy man to work for or with. He was impatient with bureaucratic process when it interfered with getting results. He was direct to the point of bluntness when he believed a superior was wrong about something important. He worked hours that would have been considered extreme even by the standards of wartime, and he expected his team to match that commitment. The red smoking jacket he wore during long sessions at his desk was a genuine eccentricity. He was cold in the air-conditioned workspace, and the jacket was warm and comfortable, and he had long since stopped caring what anyone thought about it. He played the piano in the small hours of the morning, not for recreation, but because it was one of the few things that could quiet the analytical part of his mind enough to let him think differently about a problem he had been staring at too long. His counterparts in Washington at OP-20G headquarters found him difficult. He did not hide his intelligence or his opinions, which in a military hierarchy is not a formula for institutional popularity. His analysis of the JN-25 traffic regularly conflicted with the analysis produced by Washington, and he was not inclined to defer when he believed Washington was wrong. This pattern of conflict would reach its defining moment in the spring of 1942, in the weeks before Midway, when the stakes of being wrong were measured not in bureaucratic standing, but in the lives of every sailor in the Pacific Fleet. By early 1942, the team at Station Hypo had achieved something genuinely remarkable, working with the accumulated intercepts of months, cross-referencing partial breaks against each other. Using the contextual knowledge that Rochefort and his linguists brought to work, they had reconstructed a meaningful portion of the JN-25 codebook. Not all of it, not even close to all of it. The estimates historians have made, based on post-war records and the testimony of participants, suggest that by April or May of 1942, the team could read perhaps 10 to 15% of any given intercepted message with reasonable confidence, and could make educated inferences about additional content beyond that. They were looking at the message traffic the way you might look at a document that had been partially burned. Large sections still illegible, but enough surviving to allow a careful reader to reconstruct the argument, To understand why breaking Gen 25 mattered as much as it did, you need to understand what the first 6 months of the Pacific War had felt like to the people living through them. And I mean that word, felt, because the statistics alone don't capture it. The statistics say that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and that in the weeks and months that followed, Japanese forces rapidly overran the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, Guam, and a vast expanse of Pacific Island territory stretching from the Central Pacific to the doorstep of Australia. The statistics are correct, but they don't convey what it was like to be an American naval officer in January or February 1942, watching news come in, understanding the implications, knowing that the industrial and military power of the United States was real and formidable, but that it could not be brought to bear instantly, that it would take months, possibly years, before the full weight of American production and manpower could be translated into the kind of military force capable of reversing what Japan had done in those opening weeks. The Japanese offensive of late 1941 and early 1942 was one of the most successful military campaigns in modern history, not just in territorial terms, though the territory captured was enormous and strategically significant, but in terms of the efficiency and speed with which it was executed. Japanese naval and ground forces moved with a coordination and aggression that consistently surprised their opponents. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, a British fortress that had been considered impregnable, surrendered with over 80,000 troops, was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological event. It told the people watching that the rules of the previous era did not apply, that what seemed permanent was not permanent, that the balance of power in Asia and the Pacific had shifted in ways that even professional military men had not fully anticipated. In the United States Navy, the men who had survived Pearl Harbor and the subsequent disasters were not broken, but they were operating with a cold clarity about the realities of their situation. The Japanese carrier force was the most formidable naval aviation formation in the world. It had demonstrated this beyond any reasonable doubt. The American carriers that remained, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, and a few others, were capable and their crews were skilled and motivated. But without intelligence, without some way to offset the Japanese advantage in numbers and experience, an encounter between the American and Japanese carrier forces in the open Pacific would be a very uncertain engagement. The Americans needed an edge. The code breakers were trying to give them one. What they could read of the JN-25 traffic, they were using well. Rochefort's team had been tracking the movements and planning of the Japanese combined fleet for months. They had developed a detailed picture of the fleet's organizational structure, the communication habits of its senior commanders, the designators used for different geographic locations and operational areas. They had contributed meaningfully to the American response to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May of 1942, where advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions had allowed the American carriers to be positioned to intercept the Japanese invasion force heading for Port Moresby. The Coral Sea had ended in tactical ambiguity. Each side lost a carrier, but the Japanese objective was denied. And now, in the weeks following that battle, a new pattern was emerging in the JN-25 traffic that Rochefort found more significant than anything he'd seen before. The volume of Japanese naval communications had increased dramatically. Messages were flowing between combined fleet headquarters and multiple subordinate commanders. Logistics planning was underway on a scale that implied a major offensive operation. References to specific fleet elements were appearing in combinations that Rochefort had not seen before. And running through a significant portion of this traffic, in context that implied an operational objective rather than a geographic reference already known to the parties, was a two-character designator that Rochefort's team had encountered before without being confident of its meaning: the letters AF. Rochefort's inference that AF referred to Midway Atoll was built from multiple overlapping lines of analysis. The communications channels through which AF messages were routed were associated primarily with Japanese naval forces operating in the Central Pacific. The operational context surrounding AF suggested a location that was both strategically significant and currently in American possession, not a geographic reference that both parties already knew, but a target. The geographic logic of Japanese expansion in the Central Pacific pointed strongly toward Midway as the next logical objective. If you are watching this channel for the first time, I want to take a moment here and ask you to subscribe. The stories we tell on this channel are the ones that don't always make it into the textbooks, the layer beneath the famous battles, the people whose contributions shaped history without ever being widely known. If that matters to you, subscribe. Tell someone who should be watching this. And now back to Pearl Harbor, back to the spring of 1942, back to the disagreement that nearly cost America the Pacific War before it had a chance to be won. The geography of Midway Atoll itself is worth considering for a moment because it helps explain why the Japanese wanted it and why Nimitz was willing to risk his remaining carriers to defend it. Midway sits roughly at the center of the North Pacific Ocean, 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, and almost exactly equidistant from the continental United States and the Japanese home islands. In the age of carrier aviation, that equidistance was a strategic fact of the first order. A Japanese base at Midway could project air power to within striking distance of Hawaii. It could serve as a forward picket line from which Japanese submarines and patrol aircraft could monitor American movements. It could function as a logistics node extending the Japanese defensive perimeter far enough east to make any American counteroffensive vastly more difficult and costly. For Japan, Midway was the key to making the Pacific a Japanese lake rather than a contested ocean. For the United States, losing Midway meant accepting a strategic reality in which Hawaii itself was within range of Japanese air attacks, and the prospect of defending the American West Coast suddenly became a serious planning consideration rather than a theoretical contingency. This is a context in which Nimitz's decision to trust his intelligence and commit his carriers to an ambush of the Japanese fleet must be understood. He was not gambling with abstract strategic assets. He was gambling with the last significant offensive capability available to the United States in the Pacific against a Japanese force that had every material advantage in defense of a piece of geography whose loss would have been catastrophic. He made that bet because his intelligence told him the odds were better than they appeared. He was right. Washington's analysts at OP-20G headquarters were not persuaded by Rochefort's reading of the AF traffic. Their alternative analysis pointed toward a Japanese operation in a different theater, possibly the South Pacific, possibly the Aleutians. What made the disagreement dangerous was the institutional dimension. The Washington analysts were not just offering a different interpretation. They were doing so from a position of authority as Rochefort's nominal superiors. And headquarters was confident enough in its alternative reading to actively push back against the Midway thesis when Rochefort's analysis was presented to senior naval commanders. The story of Rochefort's institutional conflict with Washington runs deeper than a single disagreement about a target designator. It reflects something fundamental about how military organizations process intelligence and how they distribute credit for success. Rochefort had spent decades building a set of capabilities: language fluency, cryptanalytic skill, the particular quality of attention required to read an adversary's communications not just as data, but as a window into intention, that were genuinely rare. He had also spent those decades in an institutional environment that valued hierarchy, procedural compliance, and the appearance of coordination over the messy reality of people who were right about things their superiors were wrong about. The tension was not unique to Rochefort or to the American Navy. It appears throughout the history of intelligence work in every era and every service. The people who are best at understanding an adversary tend to be the same people who are least comfortable with institutional constraints. Their expertise is personal and tacit. It lives in their heads in ways that resist easy transmission through formal reporting channels. Their confidence in their conclusions tends to outrun their ability to explain those conclusions in terms that satisfy people who don't share their depth of engagement with the raw material. And they tend to be impatient with the kind of bureaucratic consensus building that large organizations require for decision-making, because they know that consensus building takes time, and that time is the one resource intelligence work cannot afford to waste. Rochefort was all of these things. He was also right at Midway in a way that mattered more than almost any other right call in the history of American military intelligence. The tragedy is that the institutional system that should have rewarded him punished him instead. The men who had been wrong blocked the recognition of the man who had been right, because acknowledging his rightness would have required acknowledging their own wrongness, which the institutional logic of their position made impossible. The historians who have written about Station Hypo and the Midway intelligence in the decades since the classification came down have generally agreed on the central facts. Rochefort was right, Washington was wrong, and the strategic consequences of Rochefort's analysis being acted upon rather than overridden were enormous. What they have been more cautious about is the counterfactual. What would have happened at Midway if Washington's analysis had prevailed and Nimitz had positioned his carriers differently or not at all? The honest answer is that we don't know, and the range of possibilities is wide. A Midway in which the American carriers were not positioned at Point Luck might still have been an American tactical success. The Japanese carriers were vulnerable in ways that the intelligence advantage only partially created, and the skill and courage of the American aviators might have produced some kind of favorable outcome in a different engagement. Or it might have been a catastrophic American defeat that left the Pacific Fleet without carriers for years and Japan free to consolidate its holdings in the Central Pacific in ways that would have made the eventual American counteroffensive vastly longer and more costly. We cannot know. What we know is the history that actually happened. And in the history that actually happened, the intelligence was right, the admiral trusted it, and the battle was won before it began. Rochefort decided to generate proof that his superiors could not dismiss. He sent an instruction to the American garrison on Midway, directing them to broadcast, in plain unencrypted radio traffic, a false report about a problem with their fresh water supply. The distillation plant, the report would say, had broken down. The atoll was running short of fresh water. This was entirely fabricated. The plant was working fine, and there was no water shortage. But the report would be picked up by Japanese radio intercept stations that monitored American military traffic continuously. If Rochefort was right about AF, the reference to Midway's water shortage would eventually find its way into an encrypted GIN 25 message, where it would appear alongside the AF designator, providing definitive proof of connection. Within roughly 48 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese naval message that, in the portions Rochefort's team could read, made reference to the upcoming operation and noted, as a logistical consideration, that the target identified as F was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. The proof was in hand. AF was Midway. Rochefort had been right all along. Admiral Chester Nimitz received the confirmation with the manner of a man who had been waiting for it. Calm, methodical, deliberate. He processed information quickly and made decisions clearly, and then committed to them without looking back. Now, with proof in hand, he was ready to act. But his resources were thin. The battleships that had formed the traditional core of American naval doctrine lay on the bottom of Pearl Harbor or in the yards being repaired. What Nimitz had were carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the badly damaged Yorktown. The Yorktown had been hit at the Coral Sea. The Navy's own engineers estimated she would need 90 days of repairs before she could return to action. 90 days was time that didn't exist. Nimitz went to the dry dock, looked at the damage himself, talked to the workers and the engineers, and gave the repair crew 72 hours. 3 days. 1,400 workers went into the Yorktown around the clock. They welded new steel over torn bulkheads. They patched compartments that should have been rebuilt from the frame. They rerouted systems around damage they didn't have time to fix properly. They did in 72 hours what the standard assessment said would take 90 days, and what they produced was not a perfect ship. It was a seaworthy one, which was all Nimitz needed. The question of what Admiral Yamamoto actually knew about American capabilities in the spring of 1942 is one that historians have examined from multiple angles. Yamamoto was not an unsophisticated man. He had studied in the United States at Harvard, and he had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues in the Japanese military establishment. He knew that if the war in the Pacific became a prolonged contest of industrial production, Japan would eventually lose. This is why he had insisted on the Pearl Harbor attack. He believed that Japan's only chance of achieving strategic objectives was to deliver a knockout blow at the outset. Pearl Harbor had not achieved that objective. The carriers had not been in port. Now, at Midway, Yamamoto intended to finish the job. What Yamamoto did not know, what no one on the Japanese side of the story knew or suspected or would have believed if told, was that the communication system on which his entire operational planning depended had been penetrated. The messages his commanders sent to each other as they refined the Midway plan, coordinated their logistics, arranged their rendezvous points. All of it was flowing into the basement at Pearl Harbor, where Rochefort's team was working to extract every usable fragment. One Japanese intelligence failure, in particular, deserves attention. Before the Midway operation began, Japanese intelligence assessed that the Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea, would be out of action for at least several months. Their estimate was that she would need 90 days in a repair yard. The estimate was not unreasonable given the damage she had sustained, but it was wrong. And it meant that Nagumo's operational planning at Midway was based on the assumption that he faced 2 American carriers, not 3. The unexpected presence of the Yorktown was completely unexpected. In a battle decided by margins as thin as Midway was, that third carrier contributed materially to the outcome. The 3 American carrier task forces assembled for Midway were built around the Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and around the Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who by seniority held overall command. Spruance had not commanded carriers before. He was a cruiser officer, but he had been personally recommended by Vice Admiral William Halsey, who was hospitalized and could not sail. The choice proved to be one of the best personnel decisions of the Pacific War. Spruance would handle the most critical decisions of the battle with precision and a willingness to accept calculated risk that, in retrospect, were almost perfectly calibrated for the situation. Nimitz gave both commanders their intelligence briefing before they sailed. He told them what Station Hypo had determined. The Japanese were coming to Midway, a large carrier force was involved, and the attack would come from the northwest around June 4th. He told them to position their forces northeast of Midway, at a point designated Point Luck. From Point Luck, they would be outside the Japanese search patterns and positioned to attack the Japanese carriers at their moment of maximum vulnerability. He also told them that the intelligence was imperfect and that they should use their own judgment if the situation developed unexpectedly. This is what good command looks like, not the imposition of a rigid plan on a dynamic situation. The alignment of competent subordinates with sufficient information to act effectively when the unexpected happens. The courage of the American air crews at Midway deserves to be spoken about directly, because there is a way in which the emphasis on intelligence can inadvertently obscure the human dimension of what happened on June 4th. The intelligence told Nimitz where to put his carriers. It did not guarantee that the attack would succeed, and in the early hours of the battle, it was far from clear that it would. The American torpedo bomber squadrons that attacked the Japanese carriers flew into one of the most lethal concentrations of defensive fire in the Pacific War. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the Hornet, lost 15 of its 16 aircraft. The surviving pilot, Ensign George Gay, watched his entire squadron die around him and was shot down himself shortly thereafter, floating in the water below the Japanese fleet for hours, watching the battle develop around him from the surface of the ocean. He survived. Most of the squadron did not. The other torpedo squadrons suffered comparably. The total American torpedo bomber loss rate on June 4th was catastrophic. Well over half the aircraft committed, and the proportion of killed air crew was higher still, because torpedo bomber crews had almost no chance of survival if their aircraft went down over the Japanese fleet. These men knew the odds they were flying against. They flew the attack anyway. They pressed it home because that was what they had been trained to do, and because someone had to hold the Japanese fighters at sea level while something else happened above. The something else was the dive bombers. 47 Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived above the Japanese carrier force at almost the same moment, coming out of a broken overcast that had concealed their approach. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for hours, flying beyond his fuel margin, refusing to turn back until he found what he was looking for. He spotted the wake of the Japanese destroyer moving at high speed and followed it. When the clouds parted and the 4 carriers appeared below him, he made the assessment and gave the order. The dive bombers rolled over and went down. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Nagumo had launched his first wave against Midway before dawn. 108 planes swept down on the atoll. The defenders had been warned. Every aircraft that could fly had been scrambled. Anti-aircraft batteries were fully manned. The attack caused significant damage, but when the strike leader radioed back, the conclusion was clear. The runway was still operational. A second strike would be needed. Nagumo ordered the rearming. Torpedoes off his reserve aircraft, land attack bombs on. While this was underway, while the decks of the Japanese carriers were crowded with aircraft being rearmed, fuel lines running, bomb carts moving. A scout plane sent back a report. American ships to the northeast. One appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo reversed the rearming order. Torpedoes back on. But the reversal came in the middle of the operation. Aircraft were being reloaded. The bombs stripped off during the first reversal were stacked on hangar decks because there wasn't time to return them to the magazines. The aircraft from the first Midway strike were returning low on fuel, needing to land before the deck could be used for anything else. The 4 Japanese carriers were in the most vulnerable state a carrier can be, transitioning, their decks in motion, their aircraft exposed, their fuel lines live. At 10:22 in the morning, the American dive bombers found them. The Akagi took 2 bombs. One struck near the center of the flight deck and penetrated into the hangar bay, where the bombs removed during the rearming were stacked on carts, not yet returned to the magazine. The explosion reached the stack bombs. The explosions reached the fuel lines. The fire was immediate and uncontrollable. The Kaga took 4 bombs in rapid succession and began to burn from stem to stern. The Soryu took 3 bombs and was transformed within minutes into a vessel no longer capable of any military function. 3 carriers, in approximately 6 minutes. The interval between the first bomb hitting the Akagi and the last bomb hitting the Soryu was perhaps 6 minutes, the same amount of time it takes to eat breakfast. In that interval, Japan lost 3 of its 4 frontline fleet carriers. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, survived the initial attack and launched retaliatory strikes that found the Yorktown and ultimately doomed her. But the Hiryu was found and destroyed by American dive bombers in the late afternoon of June 4th. By the time night fell, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were either sunk or burning and beyond saving. The losses Japan sustained at Midway were not just quantitative. They were qualitative in a way that could not easily be repaired. The 4 carriers had trained their air groups over years. The pilots who died had developed skills that took time and resources to build. The reserve of trained carrier pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy was not deep. From Midway forward, Japan was reacting. The Pacific War was moving in one direction only. The men who made this possible went home in silence. The code breakers of Station Hypo could not tell their families what they had done. The secret of American code breaking in the Pacific was too valuable to reveal. If Japan had learned that JN-25 had been compromised, they would have overhauled their entire communication system. And so the men who won the Battle of Midway before it began returned to civilian life, carrying knowledge they could not share, credit they could not claim, and recognition that would not come for decades. There is something I want to say about the nature of the men who did this work, because it gets overlooked in the retelling. The analysts and linguists of Station Hypo were not, for the most part, men who had signed up to be intelligence officers. They were naval officers who had acquired specialized skills, language skills, mathematical abilities, the particular kind of patience required for sustained analytical work, and who had been assigned to the intelligence field because those skills were needed there. The work was grinding in ways that took a physical and psychological toll. The hours were extreme. The pressure was constant. Rochefort himself was, by all accounts, operating at the edge of his endurance through much of the spring of 1942. He was sleeping in the office, eating irregularly, relying on the structure of the analytical problem to keep him focused when the fatigue should have incapacitated him. Thomas Dyer, the mathematician on the team whose work on stripping the additive superencipherment was foundational to what Station Hypo achieved, described the period before Midway as the most intense sustained effort of his life. Joseph Finnegan, who specialized in Japanese naval vocabulary and whose ability to read the partial messages in context was essential to making sense of the fragments, remembered the confirmation of the AF identification as one of the defining moments of his professional life, not because it was dramatic, but because of what it meant. After months of working in uncertainty, defending conclusions against institutional skepticism without being able to prove them definitively, the confirmation was a moment when months of effort resolved into clarity. These are not famous names. They should be. The courage of the Midway air crews is rightly celebrated. The vision of Admiral Nimitz in trusting his intelligence and positioning his fleet is rightly honored. But the foundation on which all of that rested, the work that made the intelligence possible, was done by people who will never be household names, working in a basement in the dark, in the weeks after the worst defeat in American naval history, refusing to stop. The story of what happened to American signals intelligence after Midway is itself worth telling, because a victory at Midway did not simply secure the intelligence advantage. It threatened to expose it. After the battle, American newspapers published stories suggesting that the American Navy had possessed advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions. The most significant was a piece in the Chicago Tribune that ran just days after the battle and made clear to any Japanese intelligence officer reading it that the Americans had known something substantial about the operation before it began. The Navy launched an investigation. The Justice Department convened a grand jury. In the end, through a combination of deliberate obfuscation in the official statements about the battle, the unwillingness of the grand jury to indict a newspaper during wartime, and a degree of Japanese unwillingness to acknowledge what the story implied about their own security failures, the damage was contained. The Japanese intelligence community examined the question and reached conclusions that were, from the American perspective, fortunately wrong. They decided the Americans must have been tipped off through conventional means, a spy, a coincidence of observation, some other human intelligence source. They decided their codes were still secure. They were wrong, and their wrongness continued to cost them for the remainder of the war. The intelligence edge that Midway confirmed did not simply evaporate after the battle. American signals intelligence continued to develop, continued to penetrate Japanese communications, continued to provide American commanders with advanced knowledge that shaped the course of operations across the Pacific. The ambush of Admiral Yamamoto himself in April of 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted his inspection flight over the Solomon Islands and shot down his aircraft, killing him, was a direct product of signals intelligence. American codebreakers had intercepted and read the detailed itinerary of Yamamoto's inspection tour and the decision to intercept it. To kill Japan's most capable naval strategist at the cost of potentially revealing that his communications were being read was one of the most consequential command decisions of the Pacific War. Rochefort was not rewarded. He was, in the institutional logic of the Navy's intelligence hierarchy, punished. The officials in Washington who had opposed his analysis and been proven wrong used their organizational leverage to block the Distinguished Service Medal that Pearl Harbor's command had nominated him for. They reassigned him from cryptanalysis. In 1985, 20 years after his death, the Navy awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously. His family accepted it on his behalf. The citation acknowledged, in the careful language of official recognition that arrives 40 years late, that his work had been of decisive importance to the outcome of the Battle of Midway and the Pacific War. There is a dimension of the Midway story that only becomes fully visible when you step back on the tactical details and look at the larger arc of what was happening in the Pacific in the spring and summer of 1942. The war was not yet a year old. The United States had entered it following the worst attack ever carried out against American territory. The mood in the country was a mixture of outrage, fear, and a grim determination that had not yet had an opportunity to translate into visible results. Japan was everywhere and apparently unstoppable. The news from the Pacific in those first months was almost uniformly bad. Retreats, surrenders, losses of territory that seemed permanently American or permanently Allied. Midway changed that. Not immediately, not completely. The war was far too large and far too costly for a single battle to transform at a stroke, but in ways that were real and lasting. It demonstrated that the Japanese carrier force, which had seemed invincible, was not invincible. It gave the American public and the American military a sense justified, as events would prove, that the tide could be turned and eventually would be. The men who flew the torpedo bombers at Midway, the ones who pressed their attacks through Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and almost all died without scoring a hit, died so that something else could succeed. The strategic calculus of their sacrifice was that their courage at low altitude created the opening at high altitude that ended 3 Japanese carriers in 6 minutes. They did not know this. They could not know it. They flew into the fire because they had been trained to fly into the fire, and because someone had to go first. The fact that their going first made the victory possible is not a consolation for their families, but it is a fact, and it matters for understanding what happened above Midway on the morning of June 4th, 1942. All of it, the code breakers in the basement, the admirals who trusted them, the pilots who died in the torpedo attacks, the dive bomber crews who survived to find the targets and press them home. All was part of a single connected event. The intelligence created the opportunity. The courage made the opportunity real. The preparation created the capacity for both. This is how wars are won, at the level below the visible history, in the compounding of small contributions into decisive moments. Consider what that means in practical terms. A group of perhaps 50 people, working in a building without windows, produce an intelligence product so precise and so accurate that allowed 3 aircraft carriers to ambush 4 aircraft carriers in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in a battle whose outcome determined the strategic trajectory of the war. 50 people. Windows of partial visibility into an adversary's encrypted communications. The result was 4 Japanese carriers burning on June 4th, 1942. The geography of intelligence success is always invisible. The battles that are won in basements don't look like battles. The victories that are secured by people with pencils and additive pads and partial codebook reconstructions don't make for dramatic visual narratives. But they are the victories that determine whether the visible battles are fought at an advantage or a disadvantage, in the dark or in the light, with knowledge or without it. That distinction between fighting with knowledge and fighting without it is the difference between Midway as it happened and Midway as it might have happened. It is the difference that Rochefort and his team made. The Pacific War that followed Midway lasted 3 more years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. The battles at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were brutal in ways that the clean narrative of Midway as turning point can sometimes obscure. Men continue to die in large numbers and at terrible cost. The intelligence advantage that the codebreaker provided was real and sustained, but it did not make the war frictionless or the dying easy. What it did was shorten the distance between where the war was in June of 1942 and where it ended in August of 1945. It reduced the number of battles that had to be fought and increased the probability that the battles that were fought would end favorably. In a war measured in millions of casualties, the reduction in distance and the improvement in probability saved lives in numbers that are difficult to calculate but real. The dive bombers went down. The carriers burned. The war turned. And in a basement in Pearl Harbor, the men who had made it possible went back to work on the next set of intercepts because the next battle was already taking shape in the Japanese naval traffic. And the work was never done. They worked through the nights and the days and the long weeks that followed Midway, building on what they knew, extending the picture, giving the admirals the intelligence they needed to keep fighting a war that was now, finally, moving in the right direction. My uncle came home to Akron in the fall of 1942. He got a job. He married. He raised children. He went to church and mowed his lawn and watched the Browns lose football games and did all the ordinary things that the men of that generation did after coming back from the extraordinary things the war had required of them. He never talked about what he'd seen or done in the Pacific in any specific way. He died in 1987. He never saw Rochefort's medal. I have thought about what he said at the kitchen table many times in the years since. They knew, and they were waiting. He was not the kind of man who said things he didn't understand. If he said they knew and they were waiting, it was because something he had seen in the Pacific had told him that was true, something in the positioning of the carriers, something in the confidence of the American response, something in the behavior of a fleet that did not act like a fleet that had been surprised. He was right. They did know. They knew because a small group of people in a basement in Hawaii spent months breaking open a cipher system their adversary believed was unbreakable. They knew because a commander in a red smoking jacket refused to accept institutional dismissal when the evidence was in his hands. They knew because an admiral trusted his intelligence enough to bet his fleet on it. Midway is remembered as a miracle, as an impossible victory, as the turning point that came out of nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from preparation. It came from analysis. It came from a group of people who worked until they understood something their adversary did not know they had lost. It came from Joseph Rochefort working through the night, reading the partial remains of a broken code, insisting on a conclusion that the people above him didn't want to hear, and being right when rightness mattered more than at almost any other moment in the history of the Pacific War. Miracles are what battles look like when you don't know the whole story. You have heard the whole story now. There was no miracle. There was intelligence and patience, and the refusal to fail. That is something rarer than a miracle and worth a great deal more. There is something worth saying about the Japanese officers who prosecuted the Midway operation on their side of the battle. Men like Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who commanded the carrier striking force, and Admiral Yamamoto himself, who designed the operation and commanded the entire fleet from his flagship. These were not incompetent men. Nagumo had led the Pearl Harbor attack with a precision and coordination that military historians still study. Yamamoto was, by wide consensus, the most capable strategic mind in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The decisions that destroyed the Japanese carrier force at Midway were not the product of incompetence on the Japanese side. They were the product of incomplete information about the strategic environment, combined with the kind of operational overconfidence that comes from a long string of victories without defeat. Nagumo's fatal decision on the morning of June 4th, the decision to rearm his reserve aircraft twice in quick succession, leaving the carriers in a state of maximum vulnerability, was a product of a commander trying to respond rationally to information that was arriving faster than his operational situation could absorb it. The first report from the Midway strike argued for a second land attack. The subsequent report of American carriers argued for a naval strike. Each decision was locally reasonable. The combination was catastrophic, and the underlying cause was that Nagumo could not know, that American carriers were positioned and waiting specifically for this moment of vulnerability. He was making decisions in the dark. His American opponents were making decisions in the light. This asymmetry of information is the essential fact of Midway. Strip away everything else, the heroism, the luck, the individual decisions of individual commanders at critical moments, and what remains is this: the Americans knew and the Japanese did not. The Americans knew because Rochefort and his team had broken the code. The Japanese did not know because they believed the code was unbreakable. That belief was wrong, and the cost of its wrongness was measured in 4 burning carriers and the strategic initiative of the Pacific War. The lesson that Japan drew from Midway, in the immediate aftermath and in the decades of historical reflection that followed, was not the lesson of the code. Japan did not fully understand, even after the war, how comprehensively their naval communications had been penetrated during the critical months of 1942. The lesson they believed they were drawing was about tactics, about carrier doctrine, about the vulnerability of strike aircraft on deck during rearming operations. These lessons were real and valid as far as they went, but they missed the deeper point. The deeper point was that the battle had already been decided before the first aircraft left the flight deck, in a basement in Pearl Harbor, by men with pencils. The tactical lessons were beside the point. The strategic fact was the code. History is full of examples of decisive technological or intelligence advantages being misread by the people who lose them. The beneficiaries of those advantages tend to understand them clearly because they have lived with the work that produced them. The victims tend to construct alternative explanations that preserve the narrative of their own competence. Japan at Midway lost because the Americans had better luck, better pilots, better aircraft at the critical moment. These explanations are not false, but they are incomplete. The complete explanation includes the code breakers, and a complete explanation is the one that matters for understanding why the war turned when it did and where it did. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, was in many ways the institutional embodiment of the lesson Midway taught. It was an acknowledgement that the kind of work done at Station Hypo, sustained, systematic penetration of adversary communications, conducted by people with rare and specialized skills, was not an improvisation to be discarded when the emergency passed, but a permanent and essential component of national security. The investment in signals intelligence became a defining feature of American strategic posture throughout the Cold War and beyond. The particular skills that Rochefort had brought to his work, language fluency, mathematical sophistication, the patient accumulation of contextual understanding about an adversary's communications habits, became the foundation of an enterprise that grew, over the following decades, into one of the most consequential intelligence organizations in history. None of this was visible to Rochefort when he was doing his work in 1942. He was not thinking about institutional legacies or strategic frameworks. He was thinking about what the traffic was telling him and whether his team's partial reconstruction of the code book was accurate enough to support the conclusions he was reaching. He was thinking the way all good intelligence analysts think, about the problem in front of him, about the evidence available, about the margin of uncertainty around his conclusions, and about what would happen if he was wrong. He was not wrong. And the fact that he was not wrong, the fact that the partial reconstruction was good enough, the contextual understanding was accurate enough, the inference about AF was correct, is the culmination of everything this story is about. You can prepare for this kind of moment. You can invest in the skills and the organizations and the sustained effort that makes it possible. You cannot guarantee the moment will come or that when it comes you'll be in a position to exploit it. But you can ensure that if the moment comes, you are ready. Rochefort was ready. His team was ready. The admiral who trusted their work was ready to act on it. And at 10:22 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, everything that had been prepared came together in 6 minutes above the Japanese fleet. The men in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor did not win the Pacific War by themselves, but they helped determine how long it lasted and at what price. In a war measured in millions of casualties, the reduction in distance and improvement in probability that their work created saved lives in numbers that are impossible to calculate precisely but undeniably real. Thomas Dyer and Joseph Finnegan and the others who worked alongside Rochefort, the mathematicians, the linguists, the intercept operators, the people whose names are not even well recorded in the surviving histories, contributed to the outcome of the Pacific War in ways that are difficult to compare to any conventional military contribution, but that were no less essential for being invisible. They gave the Pacific Fleet a weapon that did not appear in any manifest and could not be inspected on any deck. The knowledge of what the enemy intended to do before the enemy did it. In the hands of a commander willing to trust that weapon, it was a decisive advantage of the Battle of Midway. It was the reason 3 carriers could ambush 4. It was the reason the war turned when it did. That is the whole story. That is what my uncle knew, sitting at the kitchen table in Akron, staring at the floor, unable to explain what he had seen. They knew, and they were waiting. He was right. Now so are you. The ambush of Admiral Yamamoto himself in April of 1943, when American P-38 fighters intercepted his inspection flight over the Solomon Islands and shot down his aircraft, killing him, was a direct product of the same signals intelligence enterprise that had produced the Midway victory. American codebreakers had intercepted and read the detailed itinerary of Yamamoto's inspection tour, and the decision to intercept it, to kill Japan's most capable naval strategist at the cost of potentially revealing that his communications were being read, was one of the most consequential command decisions of the Pacific War. The intelligence advantage that the codebreakers built at Pearl Harbor in the spring of 1942 extended far beyond Midway. It became the spine of American operational planning in the Pacific for the remainder of the war, a sustained penetration of Japanese communications that gave American commanders an edge in engagement after engagement, battle after battle, from the Solomons to the Philippines to the final approaches toward the Japanese home islands. The codebreakers did not fight those battles. They made them possible. And making possible the battles that won the Pacific War is not a small contribution. It is, measured against any honest accounting, one of the most significant contributions made by any group of people on any side of the Second World War. They just could not say so for 30 years. Now that record has been corrected. Now the whole story can be told. And the whole story begins and ends in the same place. A basement in Pearl Harbor, a man in a red smoking jacket, and a broken code that changed the world.